All right, Sabrina, I've got 202. We gave some folks a chance to hop on here. So, good afternoon. Hi, my name's Tom Hughes. I'm with the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency and also a longtime National Hazard Mitigation Association member and a former president at one time. Just want to thank you all for attending this session. It's a busy time in Mitigation Nation right now, and I think this Riverine information that we're going to be going over is very timely for what we're seeing here with the flash flooding, et cetera, and cascading events. I need to run through a few of the NHMA slides, and then we'll get to our panelists, introduction of the panelists, and then we'll be off to the races with the information you guys signed up for. So we're a all-volunteer organization, nationally a nonprofit, and just a range of partners. This is just a small list of folks that are part of this organization. And again, we are all dedicated to reducing natural hazard risks and advancing climate adaptation through planning, hazard mitigation, and community resilience. Just our role, trying to be, in the hazard mitigation space, an advocate, trying to educate folks, through education and outreach, try to connect folks, looking at innovative ways, especially now with less staff, less resources, and try to be a leader and sit with the federal advisory committees, et cetera. And so through we have a number of committees in the National Hazard Mitigation Association. Here is the list of committees. Should you be interested, also put that in the chat. We do meet monthly, each of these committees, and always looking for folks' input and assistance. And here are happy faces here of all the board members currently on the NHMA board. And we have another a bunch of members here too that let us know too if you're willing to actually join the board too through the process here through the chat. I want to welcome you all again, and I have some folks here that put together a team for this Riverine flooding webinar. Destiny Colorado, she's a state hazard mitigation officer with the Arizona Department of Emergency and Military Affairs. We have a young fella, Steve Ferryman, as a CFM. He's the mitigation branch chief with the Ohio Emergency Management Agency, and also Juan Bassano here with KBA. Juan has actually assisted NHMA in putting a number of these modules. Some of you already sat through our BCA modules that we've given. So there's more standby. And again, Tom Hughes with the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency. So the purpose of our session here today is introduce the riverine flooding mitigation within the context of FEMA's Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program. And to do that, our considerations today will be riverine flooding mitigation is complex, a wide variety of needs and mitigation strategies. We want a clear understanding of the program eligibility and documentation requirements. It's very critical now, especially with the shrinking FEMA force, to make sure we get it right to them so we don't get a lot of RFIs. They just don't have the staff. The hazard mitigation assistance specifically allows for many different mitigation actions to address riverine flooding risk, and this presentation will cover only some of what trainees may encounter. And the training will also look at data needed for applications and BCAs. Okay, just to run a show here. The first three items here we're looking at here on this slide, Steve will cover, and then from 4, 5, and 6, I'll cover those, and then Destiny will cover 7 and 8, and then Juan will help us with the wrap up at the top of the hour. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve. It's all yours.
Okay, thanks, Tom. I will pay you back for that old guy joke later as I slip on my glasses here so I can see what we're doing. We're going to start out by talking about riverine flood risk and trying to put that in context because it really does frame the rest of what we're going to talk about here with the National Flood Insurance Program and the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Grant programs. So the next slide, please. Or can I do it? Nope. Yep. There we go. Okay. So we're going to start off with the screenshot of the National Risk Index. The NRI uses large national data sets to estimate flood risk and risk from 17 other hazards. The NRI uses basically three components: social vulnerability, community resilience, and expected annual loss to generate a risk number by county or census block. The NRI data is useful for planning purposes, but lacks a lot of granularity that you need for flood hazard area permitting and other regulatory or life safety decisions. Flood risk is a national concern, but varies locally. Every region has some degree of riverine flood risk, though the severity differs by county. And even moderate or low risk areas are not risk free. There's a statistic that people that are familiar with the National Flood Insurance Program hear and use all the time, that 30% of the claims every year come outside of mapped flood hazard areas. So just because you're not mapped in the FEMA floodplain or mapped in a FEMA floodplain doesn't mean that you're risk free. Next slide, please. So what are some of the impacts that can occur when we do have large riverine flood events? Obviously, damages to homes and businesses, disruption to transportation corridors, water, wastewater treatment impacts, crop and livestock losses, displacement or harm to people. And some of the stats on this slide, you can't really say it much better than this. Since 1980, we've had over 45 $1 billion inland flooding disasters, and those numbers just keep going up and up and up every year. And what we're trying to do through mitigation is to break that cycle of constant damage repair and damage repair. Sometimes these events can turn very deadly. Just last July, 4th of July weekend in 2025, we saw the Guadalupe River in Texas rise up 40 feet in a few hours, and unfortunately claimed the lives of a number of campers in Camp Mystic campground there. So, it's flooding can be deadly and the consequences can be great. Next slide, please. Frequency and magnitude. So extreme rainfall is increasing, and I kind of feel silly saying this right now because in the state of Ohio, we've just endured 2 weeks of solid rain. Our emergency operations center is activated right now. We had flooding in my neighborhood last night. So you don't need a lot of convincing for me that extreme rainfall is increasing. Intense precipitation events, heavy downpours of rain have become more frequent and more severe in the recent decades. This means that storms can trigger flooding that is occurring more often than in the past. That statistic there, that 9 of the top 10 years for extreme rain events have occurred in the past 30 years. And, heavy rain drives flooding. So as the climate warms and is able to carry more water, we're seeing more and more of these very intense rainfall events. Next slide, please. So this is a map that just kind of illustrates that point. And it might be a little bit difficult to see, but, climate change isn't affecting all regions the same. Some areas are seeing much wetter conditions and more frequently large floods, while others might experience fewer riverine floods due to drier conditions. The data on this map also shows changes in how often big floods happen. Large floods have become more frequent in the Northeast, Pacific Northwest, and portions of the Northern Great Plains, where they become less frequent in the Southwest and the Rocky Mountains. Flooding is dynamic. And this map, if you were to put this map up using the same data to generate this map that we did today, these arrows are going to be up and down and look different than they did 10 years from now. But there's no doubt that the atmosphere, I think, is able to hold more rain than it ever has. And instead of a nice long spring with occasional showers, we seem to be getting 4-inch dumps within a 2-hour period. And it's definitely causing problems and issues. Next slide, please. So some key terms and concepts that we need to know again as we move forward and talk about the NFIP and flooding related issues and how that builds into an eventual mitigation project. Next slide. So what exactly is riverine flooding? Flooding occurs when runoff from heavy rain, snowmelt, or rain on snow exceeds a stream's channel capacity, overtopping the banks of the floodplain. The timing of flooding is going to vary by basin size. So if you have flashy or small streams can respond within hours, whereas large rivers may take days, hours, weeks even to crest. Depth, velocity, and duration control the severity of impacts and the appropriate mitigation options. So what are some of the causes of flooding? Well, rainfall, right? That's one. But there are others. Snowmelt, for instance. You know, our friends out west, there's a lot of mountains. They get a lot of snowpack in the winter. And that comes when that starts to melt in the spring. You add a little bit of rain on top of that, and you've got problems. Same with the Midwest. Some of our largest floods in the state of Ohio happen in the spring when we have frozen ground and a solid snowpack, and then we get rain on top of that. It is a sure recipe for problems. You can have upstream rain or run that results in runoff and flooding. So it can be a perfectly sunny day where you're out at the base of the mountain, but if it's raining up top, you get flooding. A great example of that probably most people wouldn't be aware of necessarily is there's a community in Ohio called Bellevue, and the community is known as having a lot of karst topography, so a lot of limestone features and caves that soak up water when it does rain. Well, we had a couple years of exceptionally wet weather, and the water table was really high, and so we got a really big rain. And instead of the water going into those limestone and karst features, it started to come up like a fountain. And it was a perfectly sunny day, and farm fields were flooding all over the place. Roads were flooding. It was pretty crazy. So karst topography, I would add that one to the list. But, you know, things that people always think of: severe thunderstorms, hurricanes, tropical storms, all of those things can lead to serious flood events. Next slide, please. Some common flooding terms. We'll start with floodplain. And floodplain is any land area that can be inundated by floodwater. This usually includes the river channel and the broad low-lying areas next to it. Floodway, when you talk about FEMA flood mapping, is the area that's usually adjacent to the stream. And that's the area where you can have the fastest moving floodwaters and the highest potential for debris and projectiles. So it's often the most dangerous part of the floodplain, and development in that area is restricted with the minimum NFIP requirements. Discharge. So the discharge is the volume of water flowing in a river per unit area of time, typically expressed in cubic feet per second. A higher discharge means there's more water coming down the stream. And so river flood severity is often described by both stage, which is height, and discharge, which is the flow rate. Hydrograph is a graph of river stage or flow over time. And we've got a slide that's going to show an example of that here in a few minutes. But it basically can show how a river rises and falls during a flood event, with the horizontal axis being time and the vertical axis being discharge. Next slide. Oh, I got one more there, don't I? Base flood. Flood elevation. So base flood is basically synonymous with a couple of different terms commonly used in the NFIP and hazard mitigation assistance. Base flood is the 100-year flood. It's also the 1% annual chance flood. It's also the special flood hazard area. And so there's a number of terms that are synonymous, but basically what we're talking about here is that 100-year flood. And we all know that 100-year flood doesn't mean that it's going to happen once every 100 years, but that there's a 1% chance that that can happen on any given year and a 26% chance that that can happen over a 30-year mortgage. And so that's probably a more accurate way to look at it. But, when FEMA started out the NFIP, they had to pick a standard to build to, and the 100-year standard is what was selected at the time. Next slide. Floodwater damage drivers. Okay, so understanding how floodwaters can cause damage is critical to designing effective mitigation projects. And listed here are just some of the things that water can do. Buoyant force is an uplift that can cause a structure to float, to come up off of its foundation and float downstream. Hydrostatic force would be a force that's exerted on a structure from still water. So that would be like where you have water on the outside of the house, but the inside of the house is dry, which, as you can imagine, would put a lot of pressure on those walls and cause walls to collapse and fall in. Hydrodynamic force is a force from the water flowing by a structure, which can cause scour and push on walls as well. That's the type of force that you're going to have in that floodway area, which is the area closest to your stream. Debris impacts, again, in that floodway area, because it is the fastest moving water, you're going to have the highest potential for floating trees, vehicles, manufactured homes underneath bridges. The water, it's really crazy what water can move and push downstream. Water damage and contamination. So water, even after it's receded, floodwaters are not clean. It's not like the water that comes out of your tap. It's got gross things in it. And if you leave that uncleaned, it's going to cause you problems long term when you talk about mold and other issues. Next slide. Okay, so this is a slide that's showing a hydrograph. And this is an example of a National Weather Service hydrograph. So the NWS operates a nationwide network of river gauges. The National Weather Service uses rainfall forecasts and upstream conditions to issue river flood threat levels. And the levels there that they talk about are indicated in the different colors on this hydrograph. The first one there at the bottom is what they call the action stage, and that's the lowest level of flooding concern, and that's generally going to trigger people to say, "Hey, the river's on the rise. Maybe we need to shut off these roads. Maybe we need to start thinking about these evacuation routes and how it's going to be affected." That type of action at that level. The next stage is minor flooding. And there, the river's out of its banks, and it's usually affecting things like low-lying areas near the river. It could be crops, it could be parks, things that are, if they flood, especially for a short term, it's not going to be hugely detrimental, but still, by definition, a flood nonetheless. And so that's the minor levels there. Moderate flood stage is where you start to get into damage to structures. You start having homes and businesses affected, and that's when EMA and folks at your NFIP offices really start taking account of what's going on. And then major flooding is pretty much what it sounds like. It's severe flooding, multiple neighborhoods or businesses or downtown areas, significant impacts from that particular flood event. That's represented by the purple on this graph. Again, along the bottom of this graph is time, and then stage and flow on the y-axis there. Next slide. So let's talk about the National Flood Insurance Program. And basically, the National Flood Insurance Program was established by Congress in 1968. to address the continual cycle of flooding that we were seeing. Insurance companies didn't want to take on the risk of providing flood insurance to people because if your pool of coverage is in a certain area and that entire area gets flooded, you're going to go out of business. So the federal government stepped in and created the National Flood Insurance Program. And the NFIP in a nutshell is basically the community agrees to adopt and enforce floodplain management regulations. And in return, the federal government makes flood insurance available to anyone in the community that wishes to purchase it. That's basically the NFIP in a nutshell. So new development is supposed to be permitted through your local floodplain management office and comply with the minimum standards of the NFIP, usually mean built above the flood level, that lowest floor of the structure built above the flood level. And then as older structures get flooded and substantially damaged, they were supposed to be brought into compliance as the program continued through the years. So next slide, please. The main tool that the NFIP uses to identify areas where those local floodplain regulations apply is the FIRM, or the Flood Insurance Rate Map. A flood insurance rate map is the official map of a community on which defines both the special flood hazard area and the flood zones applicable to that community. The map is used by the NFIP for floodplain management, mitigation, and insurance purposes. And the flood map is the official source for determining flood risk within the community for the purposes of NFIP enforcement. So again, that term special flood hazard area, synonymous with the blue area on that map, which is the A or AE zone. Any zone on a firm that begins with A is a 100-year flood zone, or V in the coastal areas. Don't ask me why they picked V instead of C, but it's a V zone if you're in a coastal area. I think because the old maps actually had a zone C, but again, I'm not going to let Tom make more old jokes about me, so I won't get into that. But the key takeaway here is that, the firms define where the special flood hazard area is and the BFE that must be designed to when developing HMA project applications. In recent years, FEMA has required that HMA projects be designed to comply with ASCE 24 criteria, which includes freeboard and other standards that are more stringent than the minimum NFIP requirements. Next slide, please. Assessing.
All right.
Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, go ahead. I think this is where it starts, Steve. Or no?
You can.
Oh, go ahead. Keep driving. Keep driving it.
Okay.
Time check.
All right, next slide.
I think we're a little bit behind schedule, so we'll move a little bit faster if we can.
I can move it right along. Sure can. Okay, so elements of riverine flood risk. Three major terms here. Hazard, basically what can happen and how often and intense is it going to be. Exposure is all about who and what is in harm's way. And vulnerability is how bad is it likely to get, or how bad are things going to go. Next slide. So when you take a full look at the riverine flood hazard, you're going to be looking at a number of things. It's not just how much rain fell and how quickly it fell and where it fell, but what are the parameters of your watershed? Is this a small watershed with steep valleys that's going to flash flood? Is this a large watershed that's flat, that's going to take some time for the river water to rise? Is it a fully urbanized area where you're going to, again, have more flashy type flooding? Or is it a large area that's agricultural with a lot of wetlands? It's going to be slow. The watershed's ability to absorb water, the obstructions along the water course, how many bridges, culverts, crossings do you have? All of those things are going to contribute to the extent and magnitude of the flooding. Next slide. So exposure, who or what might be impacted? Well, again, we talked about populations. Clearly, flooding impacts residential structures, businesses, critical facilities, wastewater, water treatment plants, electric. The first priority after a major event is to get that juice back on because that's going to drive your recovery. Um, Infrastructure, how many roads, bridges were impacted in a particular event? So mapping those using GIS, if possible, is really critical because exposure mapping turns where is flooding expected into what and who and what must we protect first. Next slide. Okay, we're a little bit behind, so I'm going to jump to my last slide here, Tom. And what I want to, one more. Yeah, what I want to emphasize here with this is particularly the last bullet because I haven't mentioned it to this point. But state and local hazard mitigation plans really are the repository for a lot of the data that I've just been discussing. We have 88 counties in the state of Ohio, and all of them have county hazard mitigation plans that are multi-jurisdictional. They've looked at all of the flood insurance rate map data, the NRI data, and determined how bad can it get. And those plans identify actions that the community should be taking to reduce risk over the long term. And that's what part of what we do as state hazard mitigation officers is encourage those local hazard mitigation plans and try to provide funding to update those whenever possible. Tom, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, I can't stress enough the same, for the hazard mitigation plans, you can't get into the game unless you have the hazard mitigation plans current and actually the mitigation actions identified, particularly in this case for Riverine type projects. So I'm going to be talking about that here on the next following slides here. We're going to talk about the common types of riverine flooding mitigation projects. We're going to look at localized flood risk, and then non-localized flood risk reduction measures, and why the distinction matters. The categories signal different data and analysis needs, permitting, NEPA depths, O&M commitments, and how you frame benefits, and then also finding the right funding fit. That in itself is key. Some will fit under the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, some under the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, some under Flood Mitigation Assistance, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And particularly the Flood Mitigation Assistance, is often best for the National Flood Insurance Program insured, structures here. So lately we have been also addressing these with other partners and other non-FEMA funding streams as well here in our state. Okay, flood risk reduction. One of the we'll talk about localized projects here, and we're looking at localized scope meaning parcel of small area actions with direct near-term risk reduction to specific assets. Usually, the funding alignment is the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program and Flood Mitigation Assistance, and when I talk about flood mitigation assistance, the disaster equivalent there of FEMA, the SWIFT current. If you've not heard of that one. As far as flood diversion and storage, want to point out that how you bypass the diversion channels and temporary permanent storage areas, channel basins, the reconnection to floodplain and wetlands, and reduction there for river stages and peaks. For this definition, I think is important. Projects that redirect floodwater or temporarily store it to alleviate downstream flooding. So this includes constructing or enlarging detention basins, dry ponds, or overflow channels, as well as creating diversion canals or overflow corridors that channel excess river water into designated storage areas like your wetlands or fields. And why is this relevant to riverine flooding? By giving floodwaters a place to go, these measures lower the peak flows and water levels in rivers and streams during storm events, and diversion and storage reduce stress on downstream channels and levees, protecting communities by cutting off the flood peak. Diversion and storage can measurably lower flood peaks when properly sited, modeled, and operated. So property acquisition, and I would, demolition or relocation, but I also would add We need to look at, the elevation, which I'll talk about later, and also mitigation reconstruction. We have, a slide on elevation here coming up. This is the permanent removal of flood-prone properties by purchasing the property from willing owners and clearing its structures. In a property acquisition, demolition, structures torn down, and the land is converted to open space, often a community green space or natural floodplain in perpetuity, which can be at times troubling for some of the communities, because pretty much, we've used FEMA dollars, state dollars, other non-federal share to cost share for that parcel. But hey, there's only certain things going to be deed restricted that you can use that property for. So, but again, this type usually gets your risk down to zero, if not zero. Floodproofing. We're seeing floodproofing used, particularly with businesses here and historic structures. We could have floodproofing that's dry versus wet, or even I've seen buildings with a combo. Dry floodproofing could be impermeable walls, shields at openings, anchored equipment, seepage control, or sump pumps. Wet floodproofing we're looking at consists of the use of flood damage resistant materials and construction techniques to minimize flood damage to areas below the flood protection level of a structure. And this is relevant to riverine flooding because floodproofing can protect structures in floodplain areas where moving or elevating the structures isn't feasible. So it's kind of like it's like a flood fight where the structure is. I have seen it in schools too, where we've done a combo where we've done dry and wet floodproofing. I've seen it for critical facilities. One of my favorite projects was we worked with the core of the Pittsburgh district and Etna Borough, where they were close to the river. They did dry floodproofing for openings and also, the steps that led into the critical facility. But also mucking out, they were able to use some materials there for wet floodproofing. Structural elevations. Here where I also think communities need to look at not just elevating structures like this picture here, but also mitigation reconstruction, where you're actually within that same footprint, build a code compliant house. We affectionately call it, instead of mitigation reconstruction, we call it demo rebuild. That's not a technical term, but as I explain it to the locals, that's a lot easier for them to understand. But for elevation, we need to raise the existing building so its lowest floor is above the flood level that Steve had talked about, the base flood elevation. The structure is lifted and placed on a higher foundation, extended foundation walls, piers, and posts, columns, or fill, while ensuring it remains that it's stable and properly anchored, and all utilities and service equipment, say your HVAC, electrical, are also elevated. And again, this is like a code compliant structure here we now have, but again, it's got to be monitored. And the number one thing, from an operational side is folks that have an elevated structure think, that code and that elevation is for them as well. It's not. It's for the structure. When we in emergency management tell folks to leave, it's time to leave. And so, it doesn't mean that you're going to ride this one out in an elevated structure, because we all know that, things can happen where it's actually elevated. The elevation can happen at a higher rate. And then non-localized reduction measures. This next slide here, as actions or projects that lessen the frequency and severity of flooding and decrease predicted flood damage within an area that is hydrologically linked or connected to a drainage basin that is regional in scale. And these non-localized project groups systems or options are dams, levees, and restoration. Each affects risk over a broader footprint than, say, a parcel. Levee infrastructure enhancements. Again, we're seeing that a number of levees and dams were built back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, to what the engineering that was needed for those type of events. We're seeing, at least in our state too, that these designs were good then. They're not good now, and we actually need to look at enhancements such as construction or improvement of earthen embankments and flood walls, enhancements of other levee systems, including gates, pipes, and pump stations. And there are other funding streams that can be used for that. Floodplain and stream restoration. Yes, one.
Time check at 12:36, just let you know.
Okay. So with floodplain and stream restorations for green infrastructure and natural solutions peeps, These are things that many of the states are now looking at, or looking at a combo. Floodplain setbacks channeling, in-stream structures, vegetation seeding, repairing buffers and that. Dam construction and retrofits, we're seeing that under the rehabilitation of high hazard potential dams. And here are some of the items that you can do for those dams that need assistance in meeting current needs. And less suitable for riverine flooding can be your dry floodproofing. Key considerations be repairs, replacements without increased protection. We also need to worry about dredging and debris removal. That's kind of a no-no, but I have been able to work through that with the slope stabilization grading to where we can use some of that material in the stream bank stabilization projects. And then also stormwater management is a big deal. Ineligible projects, of course, dredging, debris removal. We're seeing that even in the last events we've had in our state. Projects in which other federal agencies have authority, except when the DRA comes into effect. And then also FMA only non-localized projects. And just FEMA funding streams, there's a number of those. They play a major component, but again, they're not the only show in town, but they do allow for a wide variety of projects. When I go out on the road, I usually show 2 slides of where they were and what FEMA now will fund, and it's night and day. So you need to identify programs for riverine mitigation funding. Each of the programs have their own eligibility requirements. The disaster hazard mitigation grant program, again, can be used for funding riverine flooding mitigation, but it has to have have a disaster. It needs to be in the plan. The community had to be actually participate in the plan, as for all these hazard mitigation assistance. The other game changer is the use of PA Mitigation 406 public assistance dollars, not in the mitigation house, but can help us in the mitigation house. And I like spending public assistance money because then I actually see more money come to us through the hazard mitigation assistance program. Okay, key elements go over quickly for application development here. These are the things that we need to make sure that the sub-application has mitigation actions that address specific risk, clear design and scope, accurate and defensible cost estimates, and key data for H&H studies, and demonstrated cost effectiveness. Okay, for the engineering design, will this specific flooding risk be, will it work as designed? The hazard exposure vulnerability is addressed. The hydraulic studies are going to be required for many of these projects. And we need design professionals to actually do that, and we want their stamp. And performance objectives and hazards should be clear and ensuring compliance with applicable building codes. Again, finding out what your state code is and finding out what the local code is. Flood specific technical stuff, FEMA puts out some technical bullets that I found to be very useful. A lot of ASCE, American Society of Civil Engineer pubs that are out there. The H&H report that I talked about is very effective and needs to be support the application. And then pre and post project inundation maps. Costing and budget. If you guys have really delved into the FEMA grant outcomes platform, I'm telling you, we need to make sure that we have good costing and budgeting in there, so we do not get requests for information from FEMA later on. And I tell folks, don't use lump sum. I mean, only use that as a last resort, because FEMA is going to come down on you on that. They want to specific on how you came up with that cost. And riverine mitigation may require specific technical elements, and accounting for the cost is very critical. And also be aware of pre-award costs that might be eligible. Ask your state hazard mitigation officer or project officer if you can use that. And then we want to see, hey, they give you the money. Are you being committed to following this through? And they want to see an operation and maintenance plan and a clear commitment by the applicant accepting responsibility and knowing that they have that O&M cost later. And then, rely on effective and comprehensive risk assessments. Be realistic with timelines. We've seen that in the schedules. If If you think you're going to do an infrastructure project in 12 months, unless you have a shovel-ready project, you're fooling yourself. Engage early and often. Ensure that documentation is clearly labeled and effective version control when you send that off to FEMA. So next, I'll turn it over to Destiny to talk about the benefit cost analysis and some resources. Go ahead, Destiny.
Thank you so much. So for our benefit cost analysis, can you go ahead and click to the next slide, please?
Got it.
So for our benefit cost analysis, some of the items that folks really struggle with within this is really trying to meet that benefit cost ratio of greater than a 1.0. And realistically, when it comes to our benefit cost analysis and justifying that the amount that we're going to spend on these projects, we will see a benefit greater than that cost. One of the biggest items that we have to really keep in mind is that data and information that we're putting into our benefit cost analysis, is it repeatable? So at FEMA's level, when they go through your benefit cost analysis, they are going to replicate your benefit cost analysis to ensure that the BCR that comes out is the same or very similar. Next slide, please. So one of the key components is ensuring that you have accurate documentation to represent what you are trying to say in your benefit cost analysis. So ensuring that you're actually calculating the various benefits such as the structural losses, loss of life, as well as different secondary benefits, such as going through and calculating the displacement costs, the downtime that you may have, and ensuring that all of the benefit cost streams are actually being taken into account. So a lot of times we are looking very specifically at structural loss, and we decline to use additional benefits and ensuring that a lot of those benefit streams are accurately documented within the benefit cost analysis. Next slide, please. So within the toolkit, there are 3 main methods that we can use in order to show different damages. So we can have historic damages. A lot of times you can pull this either from your public works or public assistance folks. For your professional expected damages, generally those are more expensive to gain access to. There's a lot of technical assessments that can go into those. And then the third version is modeled damages. Now, that module was created specifically for flood mitigation, and generally it's a better option when it comes to the cost of displaying those data points. So just ensure when you're using a benefit cost analysis, different formats, that you are actually ensuring that you have that reproducible package with the various data assumptions and exports. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about the damage frequency and some of those options that are available, we want to ensure that for our utilities, roads, that we're using some of that historic or professional expected damages. You can definitely use modeled damages when it comes to the residential buildings, critical facilities, and ensuring that green infrastructure is accounted for. Next slide. So when it's coming to our modeled damages for Riverine projects, a lot of this data can be found in your H&H studies. If you do not have H&H studies, I would highly recommend that you have those to ensure that you are informing your BCA data. Ensure that you are visiting some of FEMA's websites, such as the Map Service Center, to pull some of the flood insurance rate maps. And then some of those design documents can also help drive the building damages. When it comes to the life safety, that should ultimately be coming from the applicant and owner. And then those additional benefits, such as the displacement and volunteer costs, loss of income, those can come from some of the historic documents that you have. Next slide, please. Again, for the data sourcing on the benefit cost analysis, Make sure that you're using those flood insurance rate maps and the flood insurance studies. We want to ensure that we're actually using professional documentation. If you're pulling data from non-reputable sources, your benefit cost analysis has a strong likelihood to be kicked back for additional requests for information. You want to ensure that you're using publicly available data and maps throughout that process. A more robust BCA will use a combination of those represented sources as well as professional inputs. Next slide, please. Now, when we talk about the various resources and tools that are available to you, next slide, please. We're going to talk a little bit about our Hazard Mitigation Assistance Guide. So that's our focal starting point. Now, the benefit cost analysis toolkit that FEMA offers is within Excel, easily accessible to most entities. And then we also want to ensure that we're reviewing the notice of funding opportunities for whatever grant that we are applying for. Additional guidance can be provided by your state, territorial, or tribal entity on specific guidance and barriers that have been seen in the past and best practices moving forward. So when you're going down the list of checks and balances, I would start with that notice of funding opportunity, see what the minimum requirements are to apply for additional funding under different mitigation efforts, and then make sure that you're using the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Guide to ensure you're meeting the minimum requirements for FEMA hazard mitigation programs. And then that benefit cost analysis, you really want to make sure that your benefit cost ratio is over a 1.0. Next slide, please. So there are key publications that FEMA has put out that would be key components to consider when you're going through each of your potential options for riverine flooding. So we have floodproofing for non-residential buildings as well as a guide for homeowners for retrofitting. There's a guide that goes over elevating flood-prone homes, and then we also have various safety guides as well as job aids. Next slide, please. If you start to run across a couple of issues as you're developing a project and completing your benefit cost analysis, I would highly recommend that you reach out to your state, tribal, or territorial mitigation office. And then if you are still having questions, contact your FEMA BCA helpline. There's also contacts for our National Flood Insurance Program. There are state resources as well as tribal and territorial. And then, of course, our Army Corps of Engineers partners. There's a lot of guidance documentation when it comes to riverine flooding. With that, I'll go ahead and pass it off to Juan. You're up.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Destiny. So just a quick content review so that we have some time for Q&A, just a review of what we went over and key information. So let's move to the next slide, please. So yeah, this presentation, we covered riverine flooding risk and context, some key terms and concepts, assessing riverine flooding risk, some common riverine flooding mitigation projects, funding through FEMA programs. We know there's a lot of kind of volatility going on right now, but FEMA still remains, such a large player in this space. So very important there. Key documentation and application needs, benefit cost analysis, which I'm sure just about everyone on this call has had, some level of difficulty at some point in getting a BCA to pass. So really good information there. We encourage you to ask any questions on anything you're struggling with. And lastly, and arguably most importantly, our resources and tools. There's a lot of information out there, and knowing where to look is half the battle. And it's constantly being, released more information, good information. So really, really important to do that. Next slide, please. So For the key takeaways, riverine flooding, the risk dynamic but overall expected to worsen over the next century. So we went over how just about every county in the United States has experienced flooding at some point, and we're really seeing it more and more. So it's gonna, if it hasn't affected you, recently, it likely is going to. So very important to understand that. Um, some site factors, flood maps, and building specifics all inform the appropriate mitigation actions. There's a lot of different ways to do your mitigation on this. And lastly, very important, it's complex. Flooding mitigation is very technical. Strongly encourage you. It must be done with the support of qualified engineers. I know we've got a lot of engineers on the call here, so I'm sure they'll echo that. But there are a lot of different effects that can happen, so very important to do it the right way. And with that, we can go to the next slide, and we can do a little bit of Q&A if anyone has any questions. I think we got a few questions that we answered in the box. Maggie, specifically, thank you for bringing that forward about the erosion question. We are constantly looking for additional important kind of aspects to these modules. So very eager to kind of add a section on that, maybe even to this training module, or even do kind of a separate training module on that. So much appreciated. We really like the feedback overall. So really helpful for us, and that we can improve kind of our portfolio of trainings we do. A few of you have asked, we will have this presentation, the recording, posted on YouTube and sent out. And Sabrina, I don't know if you're still on, but will we have, I believe the PDF as well will be sent out. Is that correct?
Yes, in the YouTube link, in the description, there will be a link to view the slides.
Tom, Steve, Destiny, any final thoughts before we close out? Does not look like we have too many more questions.
Yeah, I do have an alibi on, we talked about, the brick, we talked about a little bit about the flood mitigation assistance, talked a little bit about, the hazard mitigation grant program. But, there's other funding that, the Silver Jackets teams, if your state you have a Silver Jackets team, you can go to. A lot of them have put out funding guides of different funding that's available. One that comes to mind here that I've seen for the dams here in my state and for levees for rehab work is the congressionally directed spending pre-disaster mitigation grant for infrastructure. So if you lose out, you don't get a brick grant, you can't get an HMGP grant. Go and look. Talk to your local congressman or senator and see whether you can get on that list, because it is a congressional allocation, and we have seen some communities that are able to work through that system.
Yeah, the one thing I'll leave everybody with is that the best type of mitigation, in my opinion, is effective enforcement of the National Flood Insurance Program. If you do that, you're making sure that the stuff that's being built today isn't going to cause problems for the people that follow us in the future. And so it make sure that your floodplain administrator knows the floodplain administrator and is getting the training they need and issuing the permits, and do all that you can to encourage uptake of flood insurance policies, because that really is the only way for a lot of these events that happen that people are going to be close to being put back to whole.
Okay, I think that is all of our questions. We really appreciate the time for anyone. Sabrina, I don't know if you want to close this out.
Thank you guys so much. If you have any questions, please email them to contact@nhma.info. It will also be in the chat one last time. And then I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for attending.
And one final note as well. I've been working with NHMA for a couple of years now. Really phenomenal organization. If you're not involved, I encourage you to get involved or to get interested. It's a really great organization. So appreciate it.
Thank you, Juan.